So welcome back to the second part of the conference. I'm Paola Monti from the Debenedetti Foundation, and I will be chairing the next two sessions of the conference. So in the next session, we have one presentation and two short discussions. And then, as usual, we will have some time for a general discussion with the audience. So again, I invite people who are following us from home or online participants to ask questions using our chat that they can find on our webpage on the Rodolfo Debenedetti website. Okay, I'm very pleased to welcome here Claudio Lucifora, who will speak about working in the public sector, evidence from Europe and the US. This is a joint work with Daniele Checchi from University of Milan and Alessandra Fenizia from the George Washington University in the US. So you have about 30 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paola. I'm very grateful to the Fondazione, also on behalf of my colleagues, for giving us the opportunity to discuss the results of our report in this conference. If you can send my presentation, thank you. As Paola Monti mentioned, this is a joint effort with Daniele Checchi, who is sitting here in the audience, and Alessandra Fenizia, that due to travel restriction couldn't be here with us today. The topic of the second part of the report, has already been mentioned, has to do with the internal functioning of the labor market in the public sector. And as already been mentioned, the epidemiological crisis has put the state and its function back at the center of the political debate. And we realize, again, that the public sector has a unique role in coordinating activities, regulating market behavior, and mobilizing resources across sectors and areas. Now, exactly for this unprecedented increase in the size of the public sector, the issue of improving public sector efficiency is at the core of many public policies and is the main challenge for most countries. In my presentation, I will follow the main structure of the report. So I will briefly sketch some of the main features of public sector jobs. And then I will talk about some of the results that we obtain about the personnel economics of the states, showing you some stylized facts from our own research, comparing European countries and the United States. And since, of course, we are in Italy, we have added a third part where we present some specific case studies that rely on the Italian case. And in the end, I will just summarize some of the concluding remarks from this study and the policy implication. Coming second, of course, some of the issues have already been introduced by both Pedro and Pietro. So I will be fast on this first part, just to remind that the public sector employment and private sector employment are different in many respects. The public service is traditionally regulated by a rigid mix of legislative and executive acts. The services that are offered by the public sector are multidimensional. And most importantly, and we'll spend some time on this in this report, their output is very difficult to be measured. Has already been mentioned, public sector employees have a peculiar statute. They have a permanent contract. They are more stable, but also And this has been one of the comments that came. There has been an increasing duality also in public employment with the so-called civil servants that have the best prerogatives, and a large sector inflows of what we can call service provider. And these are employees with more precarious job and sometimes with worse condition compared to the private sector employees. One specific feature of the public sector, which is not that different from the private sector, but probably more pronounced, is that public sector employees that have specific information and they have considerable discretion in performing their task. And there's a wide literature in economics that show how this can be used to their own advantage. Now, there are three main challenges in studying the state capacity. The first one is informational. So the design of the information due to, the design of the incentives is fairly complicated due to the informational asymmetries and observability. There is an issue about the allocative efficiency. It's not clear how is best to allocate talents in the presence of complementarities. And then there is an issue of multiple equilibria in terms of relational contracts and cultural organization. But there is one important consensus, that is the bureaucrats are at the core of state capacity. So if things work, or don't work, it's usually the bureaucrats have an important role because they have a meaningful impact on the performance of the organization that they oversee. As I mentioned, the informational allocative imperfection make the design of the contracts complex, as much as in the private sector, but in the public sector it's being more complicated due to multitasking, to the presence of multiple principles, and, as I mentioned before, to the fact that the measurement of government performance is particularly complex. So the measurement cost in the public sector is due to the fact that, for example, in many government agencies, the output is not easy to define, not to measure, but even to define, like defense and public administration. The government provides a wide variety of public services whose relative values are hard to assess. Many services are exchanged in market where prices are either absent, like in defense, or are heavily subsidized, like in schooling and education. In the public sector, it's hard to define what a good outcome is. There is always this tension between reaching efficiency and equity, and what is the optimal trade-off between the two. And the performance, and we will have many examples of this, is available most often at the team level. It's very hard to measure individual performance. And this gives rise of all sorts of problems like the free riding problem. Now, due to all these confounding factors, there are not many credible, many studies or a wide literature with a credible strategy to identify the effect of policies, of measures taken in the public sector, and what is their effects on performance. However, there is a new wave of studies, mainly focused on the experience in developing countries, where field studies have been implemented, most of the time with RCT, randomized controlled trials. And what I want to do now is just to give you evidence of two different types. In the report, there are many mentioned. And these are two typical examples: the need to incentivize teachers, or the second example is tax collectors. So in the first example, the context are schools in rural India, and this program provided monetary incentives for teachers. Now, I don't go into the detail, but just to give you the results, the students in incentivized school perform significantly better than those in the control schools, and the size of the effect is substantial, between 0.2 and 0.3 and 0.2 standard deviation in the results of the students in test score, both in math and in language test. And also, in the study, they show that there are no adverse effects on non-incentivized subjects. Now, the second example is always a field study on, as I mentioned, concerning tax collectors in Punjab, in India. And in this case, it is a non-monetary incentive. So the incentive is a performance-based posting. So a manager that performed very well could choose where to be posted next. And also in this case, the possibility to have this type of incentive increased tax revenues by 30 to 40%. Now, many questions that were raised after the previous report concern the role of managers. And indeed, managerial practices are very important, also in the public sector. And there are two different ways of seeing the working of managers: a Weberian model of bureaucracy, where a manager's discretion is limited and controlled by formal procedure. The promotion are a function of tenure and qualification, and there is a strong job security. So many of the aspects that were discussed before. And then there is a different approach to what is called the new public management that was mentioned before and was very much considered over the 90s, and also in Italy influenced considerably the reform of the public sector, where managerial practices should mimic the private sector ones. There should be improved efficiency and cut cost. Managers are given greater discretionary power and tighter control over personnel, but they also should be accountable for their performance. Traditionally, the assessment and the evaluation of managerial practices was not in the domain of economists. There was more people in management and studying organization. But recently, a new way of studies have analyzed, quantitatively assessed the effect of managerial practices on performance, on productivity. And this literature has shown that managers and managerial practices do matter. I'm referring to the World Management Survey initiative by Bloom, Varinen, and other authors. And what they show is, after measuring carefully management practice, they show that the good management correlates positively with a wide range of performance measure, output, performance, productivity, but also mortality rate, waiting list, staff turnover, and there have also been specific sector studies like outcome in the healthcare sectors, in schools, and one example was cited before by Francesco Giavazzi. So the final point is that public sector employment works as an internal labor market. There are some ports of entry. The career is defined by job ladders, and these are characteristics that differentiate, in a way, the public sector from the private sector one. So what I want to do now is show you some of the results. Let me stress that this is, what I'm going to present is the results of our own research, original research for this report. It is not just reporting stylized fact from the literature. So what we do, we investigate the personnel economic of the states, and we try to differentiate the effect of some monetary and non-monetary aspects of the public sector, contrasting with an equivalent private sector employee. We use data from two important surveys. One is the European Working Conditions Survey, and the comparable one is the American one. They were both fielded in 2015. We ran a simple linear probability model where we look at public sector affiliation on demographic characteristics and personality traits. Essentially, what we ask here is who is in the public sector? What are the characteristics of employees in the public sector? Now, many things have already been stressed in the previous report, so I will mainly focus on one additional characteristic that we investigated that were not mentioned before, and this is the fact that employees that choose or are selected in the public sector have more pronounced pro-social attitude to contribute to a social cause, and they have a higher intrinsic motivation for useful work. We also found interesting differences between Europe and the US in the composition of the public sector. In Europe, as already been mentioned, the public sector generally attracts more women, older, more educated, and they are also more likely to be unionized. But in Europe, non-white, so immigrants, are less likely to represent. Now, there is a pronounced sorting in the public sector. So a pronounced sorting means that the characteristic of workers, of employees in the public sector are quite different from those of the private sector. But this sorting is much more pronounced in Nordic countries and less in Mediterranean countries. Please keep this in mind, because when we will come to the monetary incentive, this will have a role in interpreting the results. In the US, the individual characteristics are more evenly distributed across the public and private, but non-white minorities are more likely to be represented in the public sector. Contrary to most European countries, pro-social behavior and intrinsic motivation play a much smaller role in the US. Now, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, here we just plot a correlation at the country level between a sort of propensity score of the likelihood of being employed in the public sector with a score that measures pro-social and intrinsic motivation. Now, you can see that in countries where commitment to societal problems and motivation to do a useful work is stronger, also is positively correlated to the propensity to work in the public sector. Of course, this is a correlation, so if you wish, you can interpret it in the reverse way, but nevertheless, you can see that there is a positive correlation between the two. Now, the other important part, having solved who is in the public sector, is what are the incentives and the level of pay and pay related to performance. Let me say that not just for this report, but in general for the literature, the analysis of pay and sector choice constitute a formidable challenge for public sector comparison. Let me stress some of the reasons why this is the case. Pay differential can make public sector jobs relatively attractive or unattractive, with implication for recruiting and retaining employees. This has already been discussed in the previous report. But as was mentioned before, monetary aspects are only one part of what makes the public sector more or less attractive. There are many other aspects that go beyond pay, like job attributes, working conditions, and pension rights. Fortunately, we have a very rich data, and we will be able to provide some evidence also on non-monetary aspects. Now, better job quality, higher intrinsic motivation, more satisfaction of work, all of these involve some trade-off between pay and the utility associated to this non-pecuniary aspect of the work. So it's difficult to really compare when there are these differences. For example, a more risk-averse individual may value job protection and regulated careers, and they might be willing to sacrifice some of pay for these aspects. So depending on the distribution of the job amenities, the pecuniary incentives, the attractiveness of public sector job may change. And particularly, these attractiveness may change along the wage distribution. This has also been mentioned in the previous report. So let me just briefly show what we do, so you have an idea in mind. We specify the standard outcome equation, where the dependent variable can be the wage or any other outcome. And then we have a public sector dummy that captures the difference between the public and the private. And then we have a number of observational control. We have country dummies, and we also estimate this regression for country clusters, so both for the US and Europe, and for Nordic, continental, Anglo-Saxon, Mediterranean, and Eastern countries. So this is the first result. So the first line that you see here, so the vertical dotted line is the 0. On the left-hand side, you have Europe. On the right-hand side, you have the US. The first line is a simple dummy without controls. And the first striking feature is that the gross pay differential between the public and the private sector is positive in Europe and is negative in the US. Now, as you add further controls, simple covariates, this difference is slightly reduced, but never changes sign. So it is a stylized fact that the pay gap is negative in the US and is positive in Europe. And in the last exercise, we also implement a matching with propensity score that's always unobservable but should provide a better estimates. Now, if we look at within Europe, whether this positive premium for for being employed in the public sector is positive for all countries, we find the results that confirm some stylized fact showed by Pedro before. That is, in Nordic countries and in Eastern European countries, the premium is negative, while it's highly positive in continental and Mediterranean countries, typically as much in Italy. Now, if we look within the public sector as a whole, we see that there is a positive premium generally in Europe for health and education. In the US, there is no such a striking difference between the public and the private. The differential is never statistically different from 0. You can see that it's hard to get an estimate of the differential in public administration. It's hard to find an ideal counterpart in public administration and private sector, and then there is a residual sector. However, focusing on a typical employee can be misleading because, in fact, in the public sector, there is a wide range of skills, even within a specific sector. Like if you take the healthcare services, you have nurses, you have technicians, you have physicians, you have scientists, you have administrative staff, and all of these skills the public sector have to recruit on the market, and in most countries this is done competing with the private sector. Similar example in education, you have porters, teachers, school principal, university professor, and researchers. So, as already been mentioned, let me take the point. If pay dispersion is larger in the private sector than in the public sector, then there will be some differential. And reason why the pay compression is higher in the public sector, there are many reasons. Some have already been mentioned: unionization, collective bargaining. Considering a simple ROI model, if you have this adverse selection, you tend to have positive selection where the public sector pays more and negative selection where the public sector pays less. Just to get a sense of what we are talking about, if we assume the productivity is the same and the steeper line reflects the profile in private sector, it's easy to see that for low skill, the public sector will pay a positive higher wage, so a positive differential, and the reverse will happen at the upper end of the skill distribution. Now, what we do is we take this hypothesis to the data that I've mentioned before, and we estimate the profile of the public sector pay gap along the wage distribution. So to the left, you have the low skill, the low pay, low skill. What you have to the upper part is the high pay and high skill. And as you can see, for Europe, there is a strong negative relationship suggesting that the pay gap is much larger at the bottom of the distribution. It's almost always positive, so there is no negative premium, but it gets to zero at the very high skill. And this is replicated for most sectors of the public administration, so health, education, particularly for public administration. Now, if we look at the US, this relationship is not so pronounced at the aggregate level, nor even at the subsector. Now, as I mentioned before, beyond pay, there are many other aspects that are relevant for incentivizing worker. Francesco Giavazzi mentioned before that it's not only the level of pay, but the composition also is important. And if you see here, the probability that a public sector employee in Europe have a part of his compensation in form of performance-related pay scheme is much lower, and much lower than compared to the US. However, what characterizes public employment in Europe is that public sector employees are more likely to be unionized, and this is partly true also in the US. Now, we devoted some time also to investigate non-pecuniary aspects, so the role of job quality and working condition. Now, we do our best to get a measure of job quality that is, of course, self-reported by the employees. So we look at work satisfaction, intensity, having tight deadlines, work-life balance, the range of autonomy in performing routine tasks and involvement, intrinsic motivation, skill and training that the worker receive. Now, I just preview some of the main results that public sector employees receive. So comparing public and private sector, there is a comparable level of satisfaction, while the public sector employees report a more relaxed work pace and a better work-life balance. Public sector enjoy more autonomy and the lower routinization, but they lament less involvement. They have responsibility without having a say. They report high intrinsic motivation and social usefulness, but they also find the inadequacy of the skill level, but they receive more skill job training. Public jobs are characterized by stronger job security, better prospect in terms of employability, and career paths are typically measured on seniority and not on competence and merits. Analyzing this aspect, we find that, in fact, it's true, public sector employees are less concerned about losing their job. Net of compositional effect, they work less hours per week. And it's interesting because in terms of desired hours of work. In Europe, they report to be satisfied, while in the US, they report they would like to work more. Across all Europe, public employees tend to be more absent, but this is not the case in the US. Now, the final aspect, okay, the final aspect is about the discrimination. The state is expected to be a fair employer. However, our results suggest that in Europe, public employees do not report to be treated more with more fairness. There is no statistical difference in terms of discrimination. In the US, public employees perceived to be more discriminated instead compared to Europe. And there is also evidence of obnoxious attitudes and harassment. Particularly in Europe, verbal abuse seems to be very diffuse. Now, I have no time to cover the case studies, but let me simply mention that we have 4 case studies that could have been very interesting because they cover Italy. The first is on merit pay for teachers. The second are incentives for academics. The third is managerial practices in hospitals. And the fourth is an example of the application of incentives for management. All these case studies have common problems like difficulty in measurement output, individual or group incentives, the fact that managerial practice matter, and we try to assess where and when the incentives bites. So let me jump to the conclusion, Paola. Yes, but the report is available, so you can. So let me jump directly to the policy implication. So improving public sector efficiency has been the main challenge and will be the main challenge for most countries. But achieving this improvement is difficult, though not impossible. So the first message of this report is that the reforms inspired by the new public management fell short of expectation. They gave public sector managers more autonomy, more incentives and power, without really holding them responsible for achieving the results. But also this reform of the 90s and onwards failed to incorporate important functions such as coordinating resources and acting as insurer of the last resource. The second message of this report, which we think is important, is that intrinsic motivation and pro-social attitudes are important features of public sector employment. And they are a key element of public sector efficiency, but especially in Europe. So reliance on impersonal public competition in recruitment and on seniority in promotion may well crowd out motivation and personal attitude and may not attract the best employees in the public sector. A third message is that the more compressed wage distribution compared to the private sector implies that the public sector employees receive a pay premium at the bottom end and a negative differential at the top. So this creates a perverse self-selection of employees where low skill queue up to be selected in public sector job while the high skills shy away for better remunerated private sector job. Fourth, we document a striking difference between Europe and the US in terms of performance-related pay schemes. In the US, 2 out of 3 employees have their pay linked to performance, and in Europe, only 1 out of 4 has pay linked to performance in the public sector. Last, we found no clear evidence that public sector ensures a fair employment environment. Cooperation at the workplace is rather poor, and discrimination, particularly in the US, but also obnoxious attitude, are quite diffuse. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Claudio, for a very interesting presentation. I now invite here the next speaker, Alessandra Casarico from Bocconi University. You can stay.
So, Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very timely and interesting research. So the report starts off with a quote by Barack Obama, which also Claudio had on the slides, on the fact that the crisis has reminded us that government matters, and given that this is the week of the Nobel Prize in Economics, so let me just quote one of the last year winners of the Economics Prize, Esther Duflo, who recently said that the crisis reminded us that we need governments, from mask mandates to vaccine efforts to the design and implementation of government rescue packages. So I think that this pandemic has reminded us that government play an insurance role and can correct market failures, besides redistributing resources to those who are most in need. So given that I have a limited amount of time and the report is very rich, so I cannot do justice, so to speak, to the richness of the report. Let me see. Okay, so let me just pick up some of the key issues which are thoroughly analyzed in the report itself. So the first issue relates to who works in the public sector. And we have learned that in Europe it is older, more educated workers, and in most cases natives who work for the public sector, whereas in the US there is a different composition. So it's actually the less educated, and they are more likely to be immigrants. But there is one common feature across the two sides of the Atlantic, which is that more women work in the public sector. And for instance, if we look at Italy during these months of 2020, this is reflected in the gender distribution of workers across essential and non-essential activities. So for instance, the strong involvement of women in public sector jobs was such that men and women were equally active in activities not subject to the lockdown during the peak of the pandemic. So public sector jobs somehow guaranteed some protection to women's jobs at a time in which the private sectors in which they work were more strongly hit compared to previous recessions. Then the second key issue covered by the report is the rewards from working in the public-private sector. And I think that one evidence which I found particularly interesting is that this public-private pay gap is positive and declining over the distribution in Europe to turn negative at the top of the distribution, whereas if you look at the US, that's negative and flat all over the distribution. And this has an implication, which also Claudio highlighted before, that public sector in Europe may be attractive for the low end of the ability distribution, and implying that there may be negative selection into public sector jobs. So I think that recruitment and selections are critical for all jobs, but the more so in the public sector. And of course, compensation rewards do not only depend on pay, but there is also the issue of, say, the quality or the amenities which go with the job, which affect the overall desirability of being in one sector rather than the other. And the authors report very interesting data on self-reported assessment of job quality by workers in the two sectors. And I think that there is a third dimension which impacts on selection, and that's the status. I think that status assigned to public sector jobs has diminished over time. And I think that the data you provide are somehow a snapshot of the current situation. So I was wondering whether the evolution over time of who works for the public sector, or how pay gaps have changed over time, or how motivation has changed over time, can somehow help us understanding even more this issue of selection or sorting into public and private sector jobs. And talking about the whole reward package of public and private sector jobs, there was one dimension which was particularly somehow highlighted by this pandemic, which is job protection. So these are just the data on coming from the compulsory communications, and I try to split between, let's say, private sector job and public sectors, or a proxy for public sector jobs. So perhaps what you see in this slide is what you already have in mind. So this is simply the unconditional job loss probability depending on where you work. And you see the blue bars, and they are higher for private sector compared to public sector. But if, for instance, you look at the last part of, so what's on the right-hand side of the picture, you see that terminations were there in this period, not only for the private sector, but also for the public sector. And this pandemic period has also highlighted, I think, another important dimension, which is let me call it remote working or smart working modality, which had to be extensively used in the past month. And this has set under the spotlight the third dimension, or the third element the authors focus on in the report, that is how to elicit the appropriate level of effort and commitment from workers. And in this period, I think that informational asymmetries have become even more extreme. And so this makes, let's say, the ability of finding incentive mechanism even more difficult. At the same time, the need for high quality public services has become more pressing. And the inability of delivering good quality services amplifies the unequal impacts of the recession. Think, for instance, about schools. And I think that especially the last part of the report can give important insights on these issues. And I think that the evidence that you have in the last chapter, you had to go fast on that, but I mean, corroborates the importance of managerial practices for outcomes in the public sector, and at the same time, I think suggests that we have little experience in Italy on the introduction of explicit performance measures for the providers of key public services, and of course also of their effects. And this is related to the fact that somehow attempts to introduce explicit performance measures have been discontinued, or the data are not made available with the level of detail which would be necessary for an assessment. And in any case, and you make this point, I think pretty clearly, that the design of these incentives needs to take into account, again, who is selected into public employment in such a way that these explicit incentives do not backfire. So I just conclude by saying that it is very important, I think, to focus on the behavior of public sector employees, while at the same time accounting for the context they work in. And so think about the public sector as an employer, right? And so one may raise issues related to, so what about the training or the working environment or the technological tools made available to workers in order to perform their job effectively? I think that it is important to keep these two aspects together. The two things, I think, go hand in hand, and so it's important to discuss about the former, but while taking at the same time into due account also the latter. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to read your work beforehand, and I'm done.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Alessandra. So our next speaker is Raffaela Giordano from the Bank of Italy, who will be connected from Rome, I think. Raffaela, can you hear?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me to discuss this very interesting report. Let me share my slides. Okay. Okay, I hope you see them. Okay, the report is indeed very rich and look at the issue from many angles. So what I will do in my discussion is just to provide two additional pieces of evidence on two key takeaways from this report. The first one is that the quality of public sector is paramount, and this is especially during emergencies. And there is a large body of literature that has documented the importance of human resources in delivering outcomes in public services. The report presents very interesting evidence, for example, on education, on public procurement, in which we can see that the quality of teachers or public officers really make a difference. Unfortunately, this is my second takeaway. First of all, achieving high performance in public sector is extremely difficult, and the chapter on theoretical consideration in the report explains very well why. And second, the evidence on what features work to attract and to retain the most talented workers in the public sector is overall mixed. So let me show you my first piece of evidence here. Of course, the report focuses on the role of public sector during emergencies, and this is rightly so. This is very timing and welcome. Here, I just want to make the case even stronger and present the impact of public sector on firm productivity. So the importance of public sector also in normal times. So here I have data from Italy, from Italian provinces, and you can see that public sector efficiency and the firm productivity show huge differences across Italian provinces, but there is also a strong correlation between the two. The provinces in red are the ones that perform worst in both public sector efficiency and firm productivity. Of course, here the interesting issue is whether there is an effect of public sector efficiency on firm productivity. And we try to answer this question in a paper with Piero Tomassi at the Bank of Italy, to other colleagues at the IMF. And when we rely on a definitive strategy in order to identify whether there is a causal link or not, the idea is that the link will be causal if we observe a stronger effect on firms that depend more on the public sector. And the results that we obtain is that indeed the public sector efficiency significantly increases firm productivity, and actually the impact is large. For example, for a firm that belongs to the top quartile of government dependence, output per worker could increase by more than 20% if firm labor productivity, if public sector efficiency rose to the frontier in all provinces. So the importance of the government is huge, both in normal times and during emergencies. But unfortunately, even though it would be crucial to attract talented workers, because they are really what make the difference in the delivery of public service, we don't know very much how to do it. In particular, the evidence is mixed about what are the features that attract talented workers and retain and motivate workers to behave and provide the optimal level of effort. For example, is the salary system important to performance? There is, of course, evidence, and it was shown before, also from developing countries, saying, of course, that this is an important issue, but there are also other features like job security, pro-social values, risk aversion, that have been shown to be important as well. For example, there is a working paper by Rizzica from the Bank of Italy, and she shows that the growing use of fixed-term contracts in Italy, which started at the beginning of 2000, had a negative selection effect. It lowered the likelihood of workers of higher ability entering and remaining in the public sector. So also job security, of course, seems to matter a lot. And I would say that actually the value that workers attach to this feature may have increased after the impact of the pandemic and of the job loss in the private sector. But coming back to the monetary motivation, what the report suggests is that the fact that public sector agencies tend to pay a premium to low-skilled employees compared to the private sector, but fail to match the pay levels that highly qualified workers obtain in the private sector, can have an adverse effect. And in fact, there is, for example, the last case studies presented in the report, which is based on a paper by Alessandra on the incentive schemes for managers in the Italian Social Security Administration, shows the importance of manager. Failing to attract people at the high level of the occupational scale would be really a problem. So let me show here my second piece of evidence, of course, far from aiming to provide an answer to the question I raised before. And having in mind also all the problems of looking at aggregate data, there is a very good job made in the report in showing the difference between civil servants and frontline providers. But still, these information are based on data from Italy. This is a paper with Domenico De Palo, a colleague of the Bank of Italy. Here we show, which is very well-known result, that the public-private wage differential decreases along the wage distribution. It's lower for men than for women. But let me show really en passant also these other evidence that was also mentioned before by the previous speaker, that if we distinguish among Italian regions, we see that the public sector premium is much lower in the northern than in the center and in the south. Of course, it would be too naive here to compare these graphs with the one I showed you before on public sector efficiency across Italian provinces. Of course, there are many reasons why this is so, and so I don't want to draw any conclusion for this comparison, but let me just say that there is no evidence of a positive correlation between wage premium and performance of the public sector, in particular public sector efficiency. And actually, this is something that we could say also if we compare European countries. Typically, countries that are characterized by larger wage premium in the public sector are also those that score lower in various indicators of quality of government. But let me move to my last slide, and I think the more interesting result that we obtain in this paper. Here I plot the estimate that we obtain, the estimate for the wage premium that we obtain under random sampling, so assuming that people choose to work in the public sector randomly, and the estimates that we obtain when we control for the sorting mechanism. What we do to control for the sorting mechanism is just to look at some variables that may induce people to look for a job in the public sector. In particular, we look at the family background that may shape preferences and values of the individuals, and various measures of risk aversion. And the results that we obtain are here. So first of all, whatever the set of instruments we use, the size of the corrections, the correction tends to increase along the way, is always positive. And this suggests that there are additional motivation that may induce people to work in the public sector, and so which make the real premium higher than what we observe otherwise, if we don't control for this. And the second result is that the difference, so the bias from ignoring the sorting mechanism, increases along the wage distribution. In particular, is large above the median. Please don't look at the tails of the distribution where the estimates are quite fragile. So one possible interpretation of this pattern is that at low quantiles, what really matters is the monetary motivation. So the bias for not controlling for additional motivation is quite low, Whereas when we look at the higher wage quantiles, there are other factors that matters as well. In particular, we find that risk aversion is particularly important for men, and pro-social attitude is particularly important for women. So the problem, I mean, the fact that the premium, I mean, the monetary conditions do not look so favorable at the upper wage tail may not actually be a big problem. Let me just conclude by saying that all in all, the evidence is not clear about the role of monetary incentive in the public sector. And I think, and I find very convincing the idea suggested in the report that we should value more in the recruitment system intrinsic motivation and pro-social skills. So this probably should be further explored. I think I would stop here, and I thank you for the attention. And
thank to you, Raffaela. Thank you. So I think now we can take a few questions from the audience. We have just 10 minutes. Maybe later you can address a few points from the discussions, I guess. Okay, we can start with questions. There is one. Roberta there. On the back, before.
I have sort of three questions. The first one would be a comment on the power of incentives. We are usually saying that in some specific sectors it is better to use low power incentives, and most of these sectors are clearly those where the public is present. The second one is about the difficulties in implementing these incentive-based schemes because of difficulties in measuring output or outcome. You didn't comment on how to solve this issue here, which is going to remain there probably. And the third one is about the need to focus on a clear goal, which is probably not Pareto efficient. I have in mind something I have been discussing with Tito in the last few days. It's about hospitals here in Lombardy. Say, some people might think that we shall reduce waiting lists. Some others would say, no, you need to take spare capacity in your hospitals because of the COVID-19 patients. So if you don't clear up what's the goal you need to focus on, it will be difficult to provide the right incentives. Thanks.
One, Roberta, one from Tito here, and then one on the back.
Yeah, two questions. One is a bit cross-cutting also about concerning the other report. You do document very clearly that there is a higher unionization in the public sector than in the private sector. This seems to be happening worldwide. So I wonder whether the discussion we had before about monopsony in the private and the public sector is a good description of wage setting. In the public sector, there is much more a context where there is bilateral monopoly. So in a bilateral monopoly setting, in general, it's more efficient to negotiate not only over employment, but also over wages at the same time, so to have both. And your report seems to suggest that there are also other dimensions that are extremely important in the public sector, like motivations, hours, organization of work, hierarchical ties, all of these type of things. So maybe one of the things more important is where you bargain, because this thing cannot be negotiated often at the centralized level. So the issue is more decentralization more than the content of bargaining. I don't know what you think about this. And the second one is related to the failure of a new management performance school. As you document, there is multitasking in the public sector, and therefore extremely difficult to define good performance indicators. My experience at Teams is that we had so many quantitative indicators that virtually everybody could display some positive. Weber, one of the key points that he was making is that bureaucracies tend to escape the direct relationship with the public. So why not increasing at all levels the contact and the judgment of the customers, of the users of these public services? So I have performance measured in terms of customer satisfaction and at all levels. Clearly, not all administration provide directly services to public, but there are always users of public services that should be involved. It's easy to do now. You can have longitudinal panels of people evaluating the performance of a different administration. That perhaps could be a better way to have performance-related pay in the public sector.
Okay, we have one question here, Roberta Paolo Pinotti.
Actually, I wanted to ask another question, but then, regarding what Tito said about the evaluations from the customers, we should also remember, however, what happens with university students when they give evaluations to a class. It's not always a good proxy for the quality of a course. It depends on the exam. It depends. Even customers don't really align sometimes with the social planner or however you want to call him.
Okay, we have one question from Pedro Gomez who is following online. Can you put him on screen?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
We can see you.
It's just two comments. So one is, when you talk about selection, I think it's very important to think about two dimensions of demand and supply. So is it selection by the workers or by the government? And when you talk about education as observable, it's really determined by the government. The government open positions with minimum education requirements. So it's not that you open a vacancy and then suddenly you have a PhD coming. You open a vacancy with a certain requirements, and the same for geography and for experience. Now it's based on the worker, and you mentioned very well on the gender, because the government doesn't post jobs for requiring to be a woman or a man. So it's for gender and these unobserved characteristics, either ability and pro-social motivation. But it's very important when we talk about skilled workers versus non-skilled workers to make this distinction about what is education, that in some way it's controllable when the government posts vacancies, from unobserved ability, that it's not contracted, cannot be contracted. And when you show the graph about, I think the pro-social motivation is very important. And when you show the graph, you saw that the countries where it was most important determinant of hiring was the Nordic countries, which are the ones that pay a negative wage premium, as we've mentioned, and you mentioned as well. So that comes back to our point. When you have better alignment, then you base your selection on these other issues that are very important for micro level productivity, namely the pro-social motivation. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Last two questions, one from Francesco Armillei and the last one here in the first row.
Okay, thank you. My point is on an aspect of the microeconomic side of public administration, which has been mentioned so far, but from my standpoint is worth more attention, which are screening devices. So I think that one of the biggest differences between private and public sector is the ability and the way in which candidates for positions are screened. The private sector, of course, adopts a lot of strategies to screen candidates, for example, among the others, temporary contracts. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense in a context, in a framework in which there is asymmetric information on the quality, on the skills of the worker, and in which the skills of the worker are discovered through time. And now, at least in Italy, and at least to the best of my knowledge, the public administration lacks completely efficient devices to screen candidates. And as an anecdotal piece of evidence on this, it happened in my home country, in my hometown. And in order to screen candidates for a managerial position in my municipality, candidates were mostly evaluated on written exams on their theoretical knowledge of laws. And this is, of course, paradoxical because we have wannabe managers evaluated on their theoretical knowledge. So I believe that, you know, focusing on screening devices from a microeconomic perspective, both theoretically and empirically, would bring a deeper understanding of the functioning of public administration. Also because, you know, reasoning about incentives is somehow reasoning ex post, but reasoning about screening devices is reasoning ex ante.
Okay, thank you. The last one.
Thank you. As you mentioned, workers with pro-social motivation are sensible to opposite incentives compared to workers with extrinsic motivations. The pro-social worker want autonomy, identity, social recognition. The other ones want money, let's say. In your final suggestion, in some way, you presented both. So do you think that a balance is possible, or are we here in front of a clear trade-off?
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, lots of points.
Lots of question, little time. You know, I have Mr. Chairperson next to me that is keeping the time. So let me first start thanking the discussant. I see their discussion more as providing contribution and further points. Very interesting, both the gender dimension and the fact that, in fact, this pandemic is a kind of exogenous event to, you know, for the conciliation that women can face. And also the evidence that Giordano shown us on the non-pecuniary, or the unobserved, the returns to non-pecuniary characteristics that is upward trended along the distribution, which could compensate the negative in the pecuniary return. So, so to say, there could be an equilibrium that you know, high-skilled workers in the public sector are paid less because they get a higher returns in terms of other characteristics. So this is very interesting. Now, let me just group you know, the points. One point raised by Gilberto Turati is of course something that in the report is well discussed. It's the low power of incentives and the difficulty of measuring output and the fact that there are no clear rules, which we highlighted exactly when we say that it's not clear, you know, in the public sector what is optimal. Its efficiency is equity, or you know, what should be the best way to deal with the excess demand, excess supply. Now, all these elements that are well taken are linked to the last point. I think that possibly the main message of our report has been the ability, though very imperfectly, to measure some non-pecuniary characteristics that are seldom just not analyzed because they are not available, like you know, the working condition, the expectation in terms of work intensity, the value that individual attacks to combining life and work. So all these aspects are very important to attract people, but most of everything we have seen, and Pedro Gomez mentioned that this fact that where the intrinsic motivation is highest, that is in Nordic countries, is the cluster of European countries where the pay gap is negative. So there is a clear trade-off that the individual take into account when they Now the question is it demand or supply? We don't know. Clearly, we only observe worker in the public sector, so partly is self-selection, partly is selection. This is clearly hard to assess. But the main message is that since incentives have low power, motivation and pro-social attitudes are crucial. Think of a physician, think of a teacher, think of university professor. There is, of course, a role that incentives can play, and Tito is correct when he says we observe so many things that this should be used, but there is no way that you can properly incentivize and align the behavior of a public employee to what is optimal if you don't have, if you have a shirker. So the point is, the message is we have to do better at start. We have to do better at the recruitment phase, because after that, we can only marginally use the incentive to improve efficiency. But there is no way that after we can counteract. And for those who mention, the fact that public concorso are not the best way, this is clearly stated in the... So we are not assessing at the recruitment phase what are the most important characteristics that public employee should have. That is ethic behavior, pro-social attitude, and an intrinsic motivation. So the last point about monopsony and discrimination, I totally agree with Tito. We have to be very careful when we compare the public sector and the private and the public, because of course we didn't find much evidence that the public sector is non-discriminating. In fact, workers do not perceive this. But clearly there is more case of monopsony behavior at the lower end of the distribution in the private sector. And this, of course, can create further misalignment when you say that the public sector should align with the private sector. I hope I've answered all the questions. If Daniele wants to add something. So thank you very much for the discussion and to the question.